Our keynote presentation then is from Mike Walker. And as I said, he's going to be talking about the CMA digital advertising reports. He is Chief Economic Advisor at the CMA, has been heavily involved in the report. I'm sure many of you will have had a chance to read all 1,800 pages of the report. He won't be able to provide that level of detail in 10 minutes, but hopefully for those that haven't read all those pages, he will provide a good outline that we can then get talking about in the panel. So Mike, over to you if you put your camera on.
Great. Thank you very much, Amelia. So as Amelia just highlighted, it's a bit more than 1,800 words, including the annexes. So rather longer than War and Peace, better plot twists. I'm not going to be able to cover the whole of it. I'm just going to focus on some of the key issues that concerned us. The first thing I should say is that there's absolutely no question but that Google and Facebook, and it's those two companies that the report focuses on because it's about digital advertising, there's absolutely no question but that Google and Facebook have created considerable consumer benefit over the last X number of years. So, for instance, we know that stat that US consumers would need to be compensated about $17,500 in order to forego Google for a year. So clearly these companies add great value. That's not in question. The question is whether the existing outcomes for consumers can be made even better, can be improved. So what were the problems that we found? Okay, so I'm going to go through them under four headings: search, ad tech, social media, and then development strategies or ecosystems. So when we look at search in the UK, what do we find? We find that Google's got about 90% market share. We found evidence that Google's able to charge prices for advertising about 30 to 40% above those charged by Bing for equivalent adverts. So it does seem to have market power, implying that if there was more competition in search, prices would be lower. We also found concerns around Google self-preferencing, particularly with respect to vertical search, which allows it to protect its core search monopoly and perhaps to extend that. So we're thinking there about issues around those vertical searches, such as travel searches, which is where a lot of the revenue is in digital advertising. We also found concerns around Google's use of payments for default positions, used to protect its core search monopoly. So in 2019, in the UK, Google paid about 1.2 billion for defaults, mostly to be the default search on Apple, but also to be default on other mobile devices. Almost all mobile search now happens through Google, and most searches now happen on mobiles. So those were the concerns we found in search. In the ad tech stack, so what do I mean by that? I mean, the set of intermediaries between the content provider, so for instance, the newspaper, and the advertiser who wants to advertise on the newspaper. So for instance, I don't know, Nike wanting to put an advert onto a newspaper's website. So the ad tech stack is that set of intermediaries that allows that to happen. And as we discussed in the report, technically it's a really impressive achievement that allows that advertising to be put onto those content pages in very short time and quite targeted. But we also found some problems there. One of the things we noticed is that quite a relatively high proportion of the revenues paid by advertisers ends up with intermediaries, about 35%, rather than going to the content providers. We are concerned about the ability of Google to leverage its position in search and also its position as the owner of YouTube into a strong position in the ad tech stack. So, for instance, through the fact that it ties YouTube inventory to its demand-side platform DV360. So if you want to advertise on YouTube, you have to do that through Google. And we're concerned about conflicts of interest in the intermediary chain in ad tech. Google is significantly present throughout the chain. It has market shares above 50% throughout the chain, up to 90% in some parts of the chain. And that seems to us to lead to conflicts of interest because it has got significant shares, both when it's acting as an agent of buyers and as an agent of sellers. So that's the ad tech stack. Social media. So if we're thinking about Facebook, it seems to us that Facebook has market power in social media. And it is interesting that even those consumers who multi-home in terms of social media, and obviously a lot of consumers do, the one thing they definitely do is they use Facebook. So just to take an example, whilst 90% of people who use Snapchat also use Facebook, only 25% of Facebook users use Snapchat. And that is true for instance, Twitter as well. We found that Facebook is able to monetize or earn more revenues per user and per hour than its competitors. And when you think that most of those revenues come through advertising, and if you are using Facebook, advertising is generally something that degrades your user experience, that is suggestive of market power. We are concerned about network effects and a lack of interoperability that makes it very hard for potential competitors or actual competitors to Facebook to really impact Facebook and erode some of its market power, and allied to Facebook's ability to stop that happening through things like cutting off APIs. So, for instance, we all know about the Vine experience when Facebook cut off the API that allowed Vine to access Facebook with its Find Your Friends app. And, of course, we're concerned about Facebook's market power being strengthened by acquisitions such as Instagram and WhatsApp, but that's a slightly different issue. And then finally, the fourth sort of concern that I think that we raised in the report is around ecosystems and this development strategy that platforms have. So, for instance, Google, it's got its search monopoly, but it's also very strong in browsers through Chrome, operating systems through Android, video streaming through YouTube. Facebook's also in messaging, devices, games, and retail. And those ecosystems undoubtedly, I think, improve the consumer experience, but they also have the effect of raising barriers to entry and protecting the core monopoly. They make it harder for potential competitors to really compete against those core monopolies. Okay, so why does this matter, given that I made a point of highlighting that Google and Facebook have been good for consumer welfare? Well, I think it matters for four reasons. One, I think there's pretty good evidence that the prices for digital ads could be lower in a more competitive market. And given that the cost of digital ads is about £500 per UK household, most of which is a marginal cost for suppliers, one would imagine that most of that gets fed through into increased prices for products. That's the first thing. Secondly, content providers get less from the advertising on their platforms, on their websites, than they would in a more competitive market. And that's likely to have a damaging effect on the quality of content. And we can particularly worry about that in the context of newspapers. Thirdly, we expect lower innovation from firms that access customers using Google or Facebook. And finally, just with relation to Facebook, the lack of competitive constraint on Facebook means that there's little quality competition. And if we're thinking about social media, a lot of that quality competition is going to be around things like online harms, which are obviously a very considerable social concern, but where Facebook doesn't seem to face the competitive constraints to really need to compete strongly in that dimension. Okay, so in the last minute and a half, what are the suggested solutions that we have in the report? Well, I mean, broadly speaking, there's two approaches here, both of which we think are good. One is you need to mitigate the current harm, so from market power of the platforms, and two, you want to think about how in the long run you can reduce that market power. So in terms of mitigating current harm, we suggest a firm-specific code of conduct for Google and Facebook, broadly speaking, around the principles of fair trading, open choices, and trust and transparency. In terms of mitigating long-run market power, we talk about remedies to reduce barriers to successful rivalry, particularly around data, and I know it's going to be picked up later in this session. So, for instance, things like potentially granting access to Google's click and query data, which is a very important aspect of Google's market power and search, and interoperability, both with Google and with Facebook. And not in the report, but also a very important part of this whole discussion is that, we the CMA need to continue to be very tight on digital acquisitions, because if we look at a lot of these issues, a lot of these concerns can be traced back to bad previous acquisitions. So Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp, Google of DoubleClick. And that's my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. So immediately, I will thank you and pass over to Francine LaFontaine, who is going to chair the panel session for us and introduce the speakers on that. Francine is the William Davidson Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy and Professor of Economics at Michigan Ross University in the US. Francine, if you would like to switch on your camera and microphone.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for inviting me to work on this panel and to lead this great group of speakers who are going to reflect on some aspects of this very important report. I am glad to be joined in doing that by Gabor Koltay, who is a senior member of the chief economist team at DG Comp, Fabien Millet, who is currently the director of economics at Google, and in that role handles all current issues involving Google at the global level, but in particular regulation and in the digital economy. Christina Farah, who's the vice president head of European competition practice at Charles Rivers Associates, and Pablo Ibanez Colomo, professor of law at the London School of Economics and the College of Europe. I've mentioned their names and their titles in the order in which they will be speaking. They have each chosen a particular topic that they will chime in on very briefly, followed by others themselves making some comments about that particular topic. So without any further delay, let me switch it over to Gabor Koltay. We're going to try to keep this as conversational as possible. Gabor is going to focus in particular on search and search advertising. Gabor, if you could switch on.
Thank you. Thank you, Francine. First of all, I would like to congratulate Mike and the CMA for this very rich and detailed report. I think the depth of the report is truly astonishing. So I would really just focus on two aspects that I found very, very useful while reading it. The first is that it's focusing very much on the advertising business at the core of general search. So far, I think we were a bit underestimating how much this whole business ecosystem is organized around advertising. While actually we know that this type of business model is not a new TV and newspapers were functioning in a very similar way. Also, the type of detailed data collection and analysis that was particularly prevalent in retail and marketing even before the online era is not something new, but combining the ad-based model and this data intensive business with the search service is really a truly new combination. And so far, I think we have not really focused enough of our investigative efforts on how really the core business is functioning. And I think by focusing on this, the report also brings in very naturally the discussion on the use of data, the value of data, the fact that data is not purely a privacy issue in these environments, but really a factor of production, because this data collection and analysis is what makes it possible to really offer the highly targeted advertisement services. And that's really the new added value in terms of the advertising, the data, and the targeting value it proposes. What's also very interesting, and I think it merits a bit deeper discussion, both in the economic community and the regulators, is that there are a few missing markets in these ecosystems. There are a lot of services for which either consumers or businesses cannot pay for. There is no price. For example, I cannot pay for search or Gmail, and this leads to very specific competition problems, because it leads to incentives to foreclose, to leverage, and so on and so forth. I hope I'm within the 3 minutes, and there are a lot of other things to talk about, but I'm sure also my fellow panelists will mention those, and then maybe we can come back to those later. Thank you.
Thank you. If the other panelists could please also unmute and chime in on this issue, the set of issues that Gabor has highlighted, that would be great. Pablo, Fabien, Christina.
Oops, am I on mute?
No, we can hear you. You are not on camera, though.
Oh, let me.
Now you are muted. Okay.
I don't have any particularly deep comment other than I agree that they focus on digital advertising, which is something that had not been done incidentally in that kind of depth before, certainly not at the European Commission level, is incredibly welcome. It is in line with work that is happening simultaneously in France and elsewhere. We know that the Australians have looked into this in detail. So I certainly wholeheartedly agree with Gabor that this is a focus of the report that was missing from the previous enforcement activity, and it does add a lot to the current debate.
Anyone else? Fabien? Pablo?
Yes, happy to jump in. So Gabor highlighted a little bit the confluence of an ad-based model with the data intensity of these industry as being the novel factor, while pointing out, of course, that attention-based business models in advertising are not new, TV, newspapers, etc. So he was bringing up the data angle as the new thing. Obviously, in 3 minutes he could not go deeper. I would just top up by saying that the role of data is very, very different depending on what specific area of the digital economy you focus on. It's different between Google and Facebook, and even within Google, it's different in the ad tech chain that's been so thoroughly analyzed in the CMA report from the use of data in search. In search, just to say it in like 30 seconds, search is a query and location game. Basically, when you come to search, you state what you're interested in by the query that you enter. So if you type buy lawnmower, it's not rocket science to know that I should show you ads for lawnmowers. I don't need to know much more about you. This is, of course, much more difficult when you are browsing the web and you're on a web page like a general news web page, like earthquake in Haiti. What sort of ad are you going to show there? Clearly, the context is not super helpful, so you need to rely on more data, which is where cookies, etc., come in. And that's also the type of world that Facebook operates in, because they don't have queries or signals of intent of that sort to play with. So what sort of data is relevant and how it is relevant, varies widely. But otherwise, in terms of a general description that Gabor made, yes.
Thank you very much. Gabor, do you want to add anything in response to any of these comments?
Not at this point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So then this allows us to move on to Fabien specifically, who's going to be talking to us a little bit more about self-preferencing, which is the choice, the topic that he picked.
One of my favorite topics in the world. Self-preferencing is considered in the CMA report as a possible vector of harm. Now, we're all these days thinking about imagining regulation for the digital system. What shape should it take? And the question arises as to how you tackle self-preferencing in that context, if you tackle it at all. But some people have gone as far as to suggest outright bans on self-preferencing, which is pretty far-reaching. So I want to argue that self-preferencing is the type of issue that's very ill-suited to black and white determinations. Now, of course, here, probably the best-known case in this area is the European Commission's shopping case, where they characterized Google's conduct vis-à-vis shopping results as involving self-preferencing and decided against us, of course, under appeal at the General Court. But I would highlight that even in this case, Commissioner Vestager, at the press conference when she was issuing the decision, was careful to explain that the case was not readily generalizable to other areas, even other areas of search, that everything required case-specific analysis. So I think that's important. This is not a black and white area. But I want to talk actually about another case, which is the judgment by the High Court of England and Wales in StreetMap in 2016. And this is the same sort of intellectual issue. So it's self-preferencing, slightly different context. This was about Google Maps thumbnails in search results. And the question was very fully explored by the court. Massive document production, 6 days of trial, including 4 days of cross-examination. There were 4 factual witnesses, 2 economic experts, and all of this was in front of the UK's preeminent competition judge, Mr. Justice Roth. Outcome, very clear finding that the search results in question were indisputable product improvements and pro-competitive. So that was very clear, and it's not an outlier. There are many courts and agencies across the world that have either found similarly or dismissed complaints against specialized results. I'm thinking, for example, of the Landgericht Hamburg, the 18th Civil Court of the District of Sao Paulo, the US FTC, of course, some years back, the Canadian Competition Bureau, the Taiwanese FTC, or more recently, Brazil's agency CAGE. So I give you this tour to say that this is a subtle question, and I think one that is not well suited to taking rigid stances on. I hope that's my 3 minutes.
Perfect. Anyone on the panel wants to react to this?
I might
Christina.
perhaps.
Well, I'm happy to jump in, and completely surprisingly and unusually, I agree with Fabien. It is a unique event in that, at least in terms of the framework that he sort of sets out. Of course, self-preferencing is something that is entered into the public discourse as a concern. And my contention, which I've certainly pushed quite a bit, is that it is certainly the case that we should be quite careful about mapping across, reading across concepts that were developed for one case to a variety of other cases, simply because different players, different platforms operate in different fundamental ways with different ways to monetize, which means that they have different incentives. So in the Google cases, and I'm sure Fabien won't agree with it, but the decision of the European Commission is very clear that you have a situation in which you have no monetization on organic search, and essentially you have a strong incentive in principle, and we're not going to redebate this case, but to direct traffic towards places in which you can monetize, and that means, in effect, to the detriment of others, and the rest is history. If you're talking about other platforms where monetization on the user side occurs through different means, through commissions, perhaps through subscription, through access fees, perhaps even through the sale of an object, of a product, then you have a different tool to monetize, and then you do not necessarily need to operate the foreclosure, the redirection in the same way, because you have other tools. So the simple comment is I agree with the proposition that self-preferencing is an important question, but it's a question and not something that we can assume and assert in every single case. It would be necessary to look at how each platform operates, and a blanket ban on self-preferencing needs to be thought through and designed quite carefully, because it doesn't mean the same thing for different places and for different platforms. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Pablo, I believe you tried to chime in.
Sorry, I jumped in.
No, my pleasure. Thanks very much. And I think very much in line with what has been said, I think there's two aspects to emphasize from my perspective as a lawyer. And I think coming back to the points that have already been made, one point that I would emphasize is that self-preferencing in the discourse now we listen, I think it tends to be presented in isolation from the pro-competitive benefits that that results from it. And this is something that's forgotten. So then self-preferencing at the same time has pro-competitive effects and might have anti-competitive effects. And I think when we have this debate, I think we tend to dissociate one from the other. And I think this is something that might be problematic. And we tend to forget that the sort of benefits we attach to some ecosystems, to vertical integration, etc., are inextricably linked, are very much intertwined with self-preferencing as such. And I think isolating or dissociating the pro and the anti-competitive, I think, is problematic. And I think coming back to the two aspects, and I will leave it there. So one point I would say, I think a blanket ban, I think, would be inappropriate both from a competition law and from a regulation perspective. But then, of course, I think the whole debate is how to craft one and the other in a way that makes sense. So then from a competition law perspective, I think I get the sense that the agreement that we have here is that by object, a prohibition of self-preferencing would be inappropriate. And I think this is where the wind is blowing. We would all agree. But it doesn't mean that crafting the legal test is an easy task, in particular considering the institutional framework in which competition law is applied. I will say a word about that later. That's one thing. And then when it comes to regulation, if the decision is taken via legislation, via democratically elected bodies that we need legislation to address this, well, again, crafting regulation in a way that makes sense is an enormous challenge. And I think these are aspects of which we cannot lose sight. I think as a lawyer, I'm naturally inclined to address those, but I'll leave it there for a second.
Mike, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look, I mean, I agree absolutely, Fabien, that we shouldn't think of self-preferencing as being per se a bad thing. And I certainly hope that we don't give that impression in the report. We'll talk very specifically about issues in self-preferencing around vertical search. And I just make the generic comment that we know from a myriad of cases that where you have a firm which is both a supplier of a service to other firms and a competitor of those other firms, then that can lead to competition difficulties, and that's not dissimilar to the case I understand the Commission is looking at with Amazon and Amazon Marketplace. So, whilst I agree absolutely, self-preferencing is not per se a problem, we also shouldn't go the other direction. Undoubtedly, self-preferencing can be a significant problem, and obviously shopping is one example of that.
But to that, Mike, sorry if I can jump in.
No, sorry. So. Okay. Gabor was asking to participate to the debate.
Yeah, sorry. Just one remark. I think it's a very fair point that we should not, let's say, move from one extreme where basically we had a competition regime where we assume that these vertical efficiencies are overwhelming and cannot be any competition problems in this type of markets, to the other extreme, where basically we would assume by default that this is all anti-competitive and bad for consumers. So I think that's fine, and you can either tackle this by competition enforcement or by regulation, and it seems that there is a two-pronged approach right now. But I think one of the key, let's say, takeaways from our investigations into specific cases from the CMA report is really that if companies are not directly charging for the services that they offer to other companies, namely Facebook and Google providing display for other businesses to sell their services and products, but work through this indirect ad-based model, there will be a monetization issue, and there will be some non-monetized transactions that will always generate incentives for these vertically integrated companies to foreclose, leverage, whatnot. Now, it's a fair argument to say that we should weigh the efficiencies and the anti-competitive effects, but I think where we are right now is that we should acknowledge that both of these effects are there, which I think was not, let's say, the regulatory status quo even 5 years ago.
Christina, do you want to chime in?
No, I'll leave it here. I think it's fine. I think I agree with Gabor and Mike.
Great. So Fabien, you get the final word, if you want it.
Oh, I always have something to say. Welcome all the agreement about, devil is in the details and that you need to analyze this on a case-specific fashion, which is, what happens currently, right? I mean, all of the cases I cited demonstrate that people are able to, investigate these things on the evidence. And also, this was a wonderful moment of agreement with Christina, and I'm sorry to now slightly change it, because I think I heard Christina say that certain business models are more prone to this self-preferencing concerns, so ad-funded business models in particular. And I think I heard echoes of that in Gabor's remarks, that there is no price in advertising and therefore things are different. I personally see no difference whatsoever in the structural economics between these business models, no difference whatsoever. And all of what I've heard on the panel, and obviously we don't have a lot of time, is that different business models monetize differently. But I don't see how that should affect the incentives. And we could have a much longer conversation on that time allowing. But I think I can wrap for now. Thank you.
Well, an economist saying that business model doesn't affect incentives is a first, but I'm looking forward to learning.
So we'll continue the conversation on that topic offline. I invite all of you to reconnect. But now we do move on to Christina Caffarra, who's going to talk to us and bring us back towards the data side of the conversation. With data as an antitrust concern. So
I wanted to highlight this particular aspect because, of course, we all praise the report as a very thoughtful, very thorough piece of work with lots of empirical work in it on the kind of concerns that we have been, of course, focusing on for some time. Self-preferencing was one, and clearly this report has done a lot of work on providing effectively discovery for the world, providing data and insights that others can use. The aspect that I'm most interested and excited about, because I think it is something which is moving forward in a way that I welcome, is the emphasis in the report very much on the notion of the role of data and the notion that we need to give proactively to consumers greater control over their data, which is viewed not so much in the standard way of data protection, some sort of privacy logic, but it is very much moving in the direction of acknowledging that there is a competition issue in the relationship between platforms that are huge and very powerful, they have great bargaining power, and the counterparties that are essentially placed, operate on those platforms, be it B2B type of entities, but also B2C consumers. So the kind of work that the report has done, of course, is extensive in documenting the asymmetries and the differences in bargaining power, the various ways in which consumers are at a disadvantage. But the important part to me comes in the discussion of the remedies, which is really where much of this in the end focuses. And there is a set of interesting proposals which have to do with requiring platforms to actually give consumers much more control, not in ways that are sort of particularly well established, but there are some novel ideas, giving people the ability, instead of being in a situation in which they have to provide the data and then they have no choice as to how this data is used, providing actively to them the possibility of opting in and using as a default the opt-out. We know defaults are very powerful in these situations, and so to propose a default which is different, which is an opted-out default, and giving the opportunity to people to opt in can be quite effective and quite powerful in terms of a remedy. What I like about all of this, and there's much more to say than that, because of course the report is extensive and talks about this very carefully, is that it is also in line with movement that I see happening elsewhere. We've had in the last couple of weeks also the rather important judgment by the German Supreme Court in the Facebook case. One needs to say it is a case which, of course, isn't at the final stage. It is an interim judgment, but it is an extraordinary judgment because it is a judgment in which the judge essentially supports the finding of abuse by the cartelant on the basis that what is essentially the antitrust abuse is being limiting consumer choices when it comes to data that is being exploited, and regards this as a restriction of competition, which is novel. It is quite extraordinary because we have traditionally associated with these issues with, as I say, consumer protection and privacy. What the German Supreme Court is saying is different, and what the CMA report is actually moving towards is a recognition that we have concerns which are of an exploitative nature, that have to do with the exploitation not just of businesses but also directly of consumers, restricting their freedom of choice. And this is not just a question of consumer protection. It can be absolutely seen as an antitrust issue. The CMA report does especially talk about exacerbating competition issues that arise from this, entrenching competitive advantages over rivals. So I like this part of the report because, as I say, it does fit into this mood, into this shift towards exploitative abuse getting dialed up, which I think is absolutely essential. We've done too many exclusion foreclosure leveraging stories. We need to dial up exploitation, but it also fits into this notion that we need remedies that are creative and get to the heart of the problem, give consumer choice directly, and acknowledges that this is not just a separate issue of consumer protection, but it is actually a central issue of competition. When I hear people saying, we don't know if consumers are getting fair value because we don't have a benchmark. Well, exactly. If you have a monopoly, the consumer doesn't have a benchmark. So we need to create that possibility. And the fact that this report is trying to think of ways to do so seems to me a positive advance in terms of competition, not just in terms of consumer protection, which is one of the greatest obfuscations of our time, to actually place these consumer issues, this data issue into the bucket, leave the consumer protection people who are not, competition people deal with that. That is obfuscation and muddying the water. So I welcome this very much.
Thank you, Christina. Any of the panelists wants to respond? Gabor, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think, as I also mentioned in my 3 minutes, I really also find it extremely, extremely useful that this explicit discussion on the use of data and the role of data in competition in these markets is discussed by the report, because I think this is really a bit of a depth of the whole economics profession that this is overseen. I mean. Yeah. Really, retail and marketing before the online ages were super data intensive industries. There was Nielsen, GfK, who gathered data in very expensive ways. When I was doing my PhD, my fellow business economics and marketing PhD students were crunching this data. They then went to work for businesses where they did the same, and basically in the online world it's just really gathered a scale because of the easiness of recording data and using it. That is just very, very different and brings a quality difference. But it was already there, and we somehow totally ignored this factor that the data is a factor of production in for many businesses, especially marketing and advertising, already classically before the online times. And from the consumer perspective, this leads to highly targeted ads, highly targeted sales. If you think about that, you're moving closer to first-degree price discrimination. I'm not sure that I am as a consumer. I'm super, let's say, should be super happy about this, and also about the option that I'm forced into a barter trade about data. I have to give the data. If I want to use a service, maybe I would like to pay for the service instead of giving the data. But I don't have this option right now. I guess these are issues that I think really invite a lot of investigation, both from academic and regulatory perspectives.
Thank you. Mike, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Christina says, which is always the best position to be in. But I do think it's one. I didn't talk about it in my summary, but it's one of the things that I think is quite important in our report is trying to take forward the debate about the relationship between privacy and competition, and trying to move beyond the idea of just seeing a privacy regulation as being adverse competition, as something that is going to damage competition, and the whole issue around giving consumers choice over their data, which is, it's their data, so there's a privacy issue, but it is about trying to use that to improve competition and to lower barriers to entry. And at the moment, one of the things that I think we see is that the platform firms with these large ecosystems are using privacy regulation as a shield against competition. And we're really keen to help move market beyond that.
Anyone else?
Happy to jump in. First, with a conceptual point. Typically, I see the role of antitrust as being concerned with preserving, the mechanism for competition. And when you do that right, that delivers a whole host of good outcomes. It delivers low prices, it delivers high quality, and you would expect that privacy, being some sort of dimension of competition, would also be delivered by the competitive process. There is a lot of excitement in this area. Data, etc. There's lots of buzzwords, and sometimes there is a tendency to mix, two categories. But I want to challenge people often as to tell me precisely why they should be mixed, and why should we not deal with health and safety when it comes to antitrust? That's also a dimension of quality. Now, this is, of course, a slightly provocative statement. It's just a call for specificity, because what the CMA report does well is, yes, consumers having choices are things that can make markets work better. I'm just asking for specificity. And what the CMA also notes very well is the differences they have observed in this space between, say, social media or practices of search engines like Google and Bing in terms of giving people control over switching off personalized advertising, for example, or managing the amount of data that is retained by the system. A lot of progress has been done over the last few years there. And to Gabor's point of, I have no choice, when it comes to search engines, at least Google, you can absolutely use the service in incognito mode as an anonymous user. So in that respect, that's entirely possible. You do not need to introduce a price at that particular juncture.
Thank you very much. We have one more speaker and topic to go to, and that is Pablo, who's going to be talking to us about how cases put some perspective on the ability of competition law to intervene in these markets. So, Pablo.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Francine, for the leadership in this panel, and I'm glad to say that what I will be discussing, I think, ties in very well with the discussion we're having right now, which I guess is a good moment to get started, right? I mean, before I get into the points I wanted to make, I clarified, as you asked me, Francine, that I have nothing to disclose in this or, in fact, any other matter. And I thought, as a lawyer, I would focus on the legal and institutional dimensions of the sort of questions that we get from the CMA's report, right? So then we've been having, for the past few minutes, heated debates on the substance of the issue, and whether or not intervention is justified and so on. I wanted to switch for a second, but I think without moving away from the center of the discussion. And I wanted to focus on the choice made by in the report, which is in favor of some sort of a regulatory regime, right? And I think in that sense, what the CMA does by making this choice, I think, is exposing the matters with which I think competition law struggles the most in practice. And in that sense, it's a very good lesson for what the future will bring us in relation to digital advertising, but other cases in digital, right? So then one key aspect, I think, of the report is, well, the difficulty of competition institutions to deal with what we can call regulatory-like remedies, right? So then interfering with the inner workings of companies, that is to say, well, we've said a lot already about business models, we've said a lot about the design of products. Well, I mean, these are remedies that can be imposed by virtue of competition law. In that sense, well, it's a reason why actually we have the CMA in the first place looking into these matters. But I think if we look at what competition law has done over the years, well, it has been confined to exceptional circumstances. And this brings us back to the debate we were having a few minutes ago about the crafting of the legal test. So these regulatory-like remedies, remaking or redesigning a product, remaking a business model, well, this has happened. We have examples, but I think competition institutions have always been very cautious about that. And I think in a way, this report exposes actually how difficult this can be to achieve through competition law. Another aspect, and I think has come to the fore already in the discussions we've had so far, exploitation. And I think Christina was mentioning exploitation, and I think exploitation is, I would say, when reading the report, the impression I had, and I think Mike may want to jump on this, is that, well, the reallocation of rents in this segment, I think, is the key concern probably of the whole report. What chunk of the pie goes to the customers of these digital giants? What chunk of the pie goes to competitors at one or several levels of the value chain? And again, competition law has been here before. Competition law has tackled exploitation. But again, competition authorities have been extremely cautious to do that. So then if they were cautious when it came to a relatively simple dimension, let's call it that way, which is price, well, how much more difficult it is when it comes to quality and so on. So in a sense, assuming that there's a problem, it's a lot to assume, of course, given the discussions we've had so far, but assuming there's a real problem, I think I am inclined to agree with the ultimate position of the CMA in saying, well, this is complex, this can be done via competition law, but I think this can put a lot of pressure on competition authorities. And in that sense, and one has to bear in mind, I will put an end to that the difficulties that come with redesigning products, remaking business models, tackling exploitative conduct, these are difficulties that do not happen by accident or do not happen by virtue of bad luck or by not getting the remedy right. And I think this is part of the essence or part of the problems that are inherent in this complex regulatory-like or exploitative remedies. And in that sense, I think the Google Shopping and the Android cases are very good examples in those sense. I mean, some people may criticize, well, the remedy didn't go so well. But again, I don't feel it's an accident. If we're going to go down that road via competition law, well, those difficulties will become the bread and butter of competition authorities. I guess it's a legitimate question to say, well, let's rather go for the adoption of legislation that has, in addition, perhaps the fact that it's adopted via legislation, by a democratically elected body, and so on. But I think this hopefully has complemented the sort of comments, most really interesting, that had been made from the substantive perspective. But I will leave it there.
Thank you, Pablo. Christina, you have your hand up. Please do I should have reminded you to mention any conflict you may have.
Yes, I was going to say that first, and I do it so often that I forgot that I didn't do it here because we are short of time. So the very long list, but I'll be saying it very quickly. I worked adverse to Google, I never worked for or against Facebook. I worked for Microsoft, I worked for Apple, I have done some work for Amazon, I've done some work for Uber, Netflix, anymore, you name it. Okay, so just kind of count them all in. For and against, because I also work for regulators. But the comment I wanted to make is this. I mean, Pablo, I'm not a lawyer, but I am depressed by this suggestion that competition law is some sort of religion. It's some sort of like the Catholic Church that we have to preserve in its integrity, and it cannot move on and it cannot evolve. I kind of think that I see that exploitation is not the easiest category of abuse to pursue, and we know its history is what it is, and we know it's been typically viewed as a form of in the form of excess pricing, which is not an easy thing to pursue. But we are in front of novel circumstances, in situations in which the bargaining power of these platforms is enormous, as I said before, vis-a-vis businesses and consumers that actually rely on it. How can we be saying, well, this is nothing to do with competition law. Competition law is a pure thing that we've absolutely cast in stone and we cannot absolutely move along and never develop. I find that disheartening, and I think I applaud regulators and agencies who are trying to move this debate along. We cannot be stuck with Chicago-like sort of way of thinking about the economics of things. We are we are way beyond that. So I just find this just not a very encouraging position to be taking. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabor, you have your hand up.
Yes, I mean, having worked on Google Shopping and the remedy, I mean, I have some sympathy to moving some sort of cases towards the regulators, because it's really especially the remedies. If you want to make things work, it's really not what competition authorities are geared up, I would say. But and I think this is, I mean, you can see that this is basically happening all over the place. In the EU, at national level, there are legislative proposals flying around at all possible levels of what you can see. But there is one thing that I think also Mike mentioned specifically, that is a traditional, let's say, competition law territory, namely. We see that some of these acquisitions in the past seem to have created conflict of interests and anti-competitive outcomes that seem to be a problem. And structural remedies, I mean, that's really the sort of the simplest and most traditional remedies that competition agencies enforce. Should we not think more in terms of the separation issues? That's really an open question to you all, and especially Mike, because it seems that the report is suggesting that should be also moved to a regulatory track, which is a bit surprising to me.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I was going to say two things. Look, I mean, let's be blunt here. Competition law is just really ill-suited for dealing with a lot of these issues. I mean, Article 1 and 2 is really ill-suited to deal with most issues, regardless of whether they're digital or not. I've been saying this for more than 15 years, but when we come to digital, it's really ill-suited to it, and if we just leave it to competition law, we're going to be dancing around trying to save firms that died 5 years before we ever get to final decision. So I do think we have to take this much more regulatory approach, which we outline in the report. And then just responding to Gabor's question to me, I agree. I think we do have to take seriously the possibility that actually where there have been in the past, bad acquisitions, which may have been ex ante perfectly reasonable decisions, but ex post turn out to be bad decisions, that we ought to take seriously the possibility that we would want to go back in and sort out the market structure that bad acquisitions have led to. I absolutely think we should be willing to do that.
Pablo, you should get the final word on this particular topic.
Well, thank you, Francine. So, I mean, as the lawyer, I think it's a very important debate that we have with economists. I think we should do this more often. I will say, just to Christina, it has nothing to do with the Catholic religion, and it has nothing to do with Chicago, a place that I don't even know, actually. It has to, and I think it's quite important that we get this, and I think I've learned a lot from economists. I guess, I mean, I teach at an institution that has an E for economics in its name, and it's that institutions matter, constraints matter, resources matter. So I guess we lawyers we're not clear enough when making these points, and it's important that we have these conversations. So then legal doctrines are not capricious. We don't have the indispensability condition in essential facilities cases for the sake of it or because we believe in that. It's because we have institutions with their constraints in terms of knowledge, in terms of resources, etc. So all of that is not because we stick to the doctrines because we like to do so or because we are conservative with a small or with a big C. It's because there's a rationale behind legal doctrines, and a rationale we cannot simply ignore. So in a way, I think I would say to Christina, it's not a matter of simply, well, if you dream big enough, you will make it. No, it's not a matter of dreaming big enough or daring to dream. It's a matter of bearing in mind, I think very much in line with what Mike is saying, of being aware of the constraints and being aware of the sort of very complex balancing exercises that in particular are involved in cases where there's vertical integration and so on. You could say, well, against this whole background, I would say, well, we need a legal regime not only that makes sense, that can be predicted, but that is able to handle that. So, I mean, I will end up by mentioning Philip Arida, who's not from Chicago. He was from Harvard. He firmly believed in the role of competition law, but I think he put it very elegantly in saying, well, I think courts should not impose remedies that they're able to effectively handle. And I think in that sense, Mike's point ties in very well with those points. So I guess this is a point, and I think, I mean, if anything, this is a reminder that I think we should have these conversations to why we have the doctrines that we have as a matter of law more often with economists, because I think, I mean, dreaming again is not sufficient to get some stuff done, assuming again there's a problem. But thanks very much for the insights.
Well, I need to go, but can I say one last thing?
One last thing.
I mean, Pablo, I'm not talking about dreaming. I'm just saying this stuff isn't cast in stone. I think that you cannot be saying to me that there is no room for thinking things through going forward that actually takes into account the learning of facts and the circumstances around us. So, of course, I appreciate that there is, of course, a logic to it, that there are all sorts of trade-offs. Economists do trade-off from morning to evening, but it isn't just a prerogative of the law. But it isn't about thinking big. It is about thinking nothing is cast in absolute stone. And, of course, we want to do regulation. Let's do regulation. I don't care. As long as we kind of move forward and not just kind of hold back all the time because, we can't conceive of exploitation as a category. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to take a few seconds to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion. As everyone could see, these are important topics, and this report gave a lot of food for thought to all of our panelists and to myself, and reminded me of the important conversations we were having at the FTC while I was there as well. And so I thank everyone for participating, and I give it back to Amelia.
Thank you so much to everybody. If you could now turn your cameras off again and microphones. And of course, thank you very much. And of course, this topic is going to run and run, as many of you will be aware. And indeed, as Simon McDougall was talking about yesterday from the ICO Ofcom and CMA are now part of a digital task force to think about how regulation might progress going forward. So all input, there's going to be a lot more of this discussion, essentially. But that was a really good discussion. I hope you enjoyed it.